I am Meredith Hirsh, and this is Working Healthcare. Today, we're talking about solving real-world problems in American healthcare, while the money, the rules, and the timelines all shift at once. Venture dollars have cooled. U.S. digital health investment fell to $10.1 billion in 2024, which seems like a lot, but it's actually the lowest it has been in 5 years. So great ideas have to prove value faster and spend smarter. Research funding is wobbling too. In late July, a White House budget footnote briefly paused NIH grant spending before it was reversed, and most recently, the Senate Appropriations Committee approved a small NIH increase, rejecting the Trump administration's proposed 40% cut. So again, we're boomeranging everywhere. That kind of uncertainty hits academic centers that turn lab breakthroughs into real care. Our guest today knows this world from the inside. Elizabeth Chabe leads High Touch Group, where she and her team build marketing and PR strategies for life sciences and diagnostic companies and help technical teams launch in complex markets. She's an author and entrepreneur who has worked with research universities and national labs and helped form combined public-private academic partnerships, including work tied to COVID-19 and supply chain crunches. Her #1 best-selling book, The Giant's Ladder, is a practical playbook for turning complex science into stories that customers, clinicians, and payers can act on. Here's where we're going. First, diagnosis. Too many patients, especially those with a rare disease, spend 6 to 9 years on a diagnostic odyssey. How do we change incentives so catching illness early beats treating it late? Second, the path to market. In 2024, the FDA approved 50 new medicines, roughly in line with the last decade's pace. That's great for innovation, but it raises hard questions about safety, evidence, and access. How should young companies pace their studies and their promises? And how do investors tell a real contender from a cautionary tale? So we back the next breakthrough, not the next Elizabeth Holmes. Third, the money trap. With venture capital tight and NIH funding in flux, where do founders turn? Grants that don't take equity, industry partners, or membership and direct pay models? And if we want more physician-led companies, how do we make room for clinician founders without asking them to moonlight as full-time MBAs? We'll also look at whether hospitals and universities should launch more startups, following examples like our past guest, Dr. Daniel Solomon at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's. Elizabeth advises executive teams on the choices that matter: what proof to build first, how to launch in regulated markets, and how to tell a clear, credible story without overpromising. She's helped organizations win significant R&D funding and turn science into care that shows up for people. Elizabeth Chabe, welcome to Working Healthcare.
Hi, Meredith. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation. You've already raised so many important points.
I know. You and I talked a while ago, actually, and we had to rejigger our interview because you were flying to South Korea and actually got delayed. So you are a very busy person. Every time I've met with you, it's been in an airport, at your lunch break, at a conference, trying to go on a flight to South Korea.
I made it eventually.
You did. And I'm so happy you're on. So you did not actually take the traditional pathway that others would in your situation. You didn't go lab to CEO route. What pulled you toward the sciences, and why are you so interested in helping others create products and bringing them to market?
Great questions. I think that my interest in the sciences started at a very young age. I launched my first company, which was science-based, when I was about 12 years old. And then I had some follow-on companies after that. But I really didn't get involved in sciences as a career until I was doing a lot of what I do now, fundraising, communication strategy, public relations for research programs. And while I started in that field in an academic lab, what I realized is that there was a lot of friction in getting otherwise excellent technologies out the door into the real world so that you could prove pilot scale manufacturing, so that you could get tools into the market. It was very obvious that every technology transfer office at universities across the country was struggling with that same issue. How do we get IP out the door? Not only because that brings revenue into universities, it makes it worthwhile for professors, faculty to run these research centers, because of course they're going to get royalties from their IP. But it also means that these technologies don't just live in a research paper or in a patent, they get off the shelf and into the real world. So I did that work starting at a national lab where I worked with Department of Defense, Office of Naval Research, Department of Energy, and a number of other organizations. And then I transitioned to the Jackson Laboratory, which is an organization that specializes in two fields. One is the mouse model as a model for life sciences. So a lot of biotech research, medtech research ends up at the preclinical stage using mouse models. And then there was another side of the organization that was working on novel research in hundreds of different areas. And I came in to lead strategic growth initiatives for the JAX mice and research services side of the business and a couple of other things. So I've been in the sciences doing this sort of advising for a long time, but it was sort of a circuitous route to your point.
And venture money is definitely in the digital health world cooled down. Statistics wise, there's still money out there, but it's cooled. And practice deals like private equity going into medical practices have certainly slowed. And now there's a lot of NIH support uncertainty going on in the White House versus the Senate versus the House, and nothing's really clear yet. What forces do you think are driving this pullback?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the new administration has driven a lot of that. I think we're seeing a lot of this as well from the Make America Healthy Again movement, because a lot of that sort of underlying messaging is based in a distrust in science. But it's kind of easy to blame present administration. I think we've seen this distrust in science kind of generally in the United States for a long time. Outside of diagnostics, medtech, and biotech, I've also done a lot of work in my career on the climate science side of things, especially in materials research. And we see, the same distrust in scientific discourse with the general public, with climate change, as we do in medicine. We saw this sort of come up again during the COVID pandemic, where you had people without medical degrees giving not great medical advice on social media, and that was being trusted as much as, or sometimes more often than, medical advice coming from the CDC, coming from actual clinicians. And so I think that this distrust in science with the general public is nothing new. But I do think that the cutting of funds and the almost de-incentivizing a lot of the basic and applied research that's so necessary to keep clinicians in the pharmaceuticals that they need to treat patients, as well as the diagnostics that are needed to diagnose properly, so that we don't get patients waiting 6 to 9 years, to your point, for a diagnosis, which of course decreases quality of life, independence, in your field, mobility. It's just so important that we get people the treatments that they need as quickly as possible.
Where can those that are in the medical sciences go for capital? I've brought this up on previous podcasts, and I don't recall the specific number. And again, I feel like it's boomerang because it's constantly changing. Can we move a step forward and get this science funding, or can we not? My youngest son is at Duke University, and the hospital sector is huge when it comes to grants and getting funding for the NIH. They have a huge medical center, and their cuts at the beginning of the year were looking at about 60% of a reduction. And you had students who could no longer get internships this summer at Duke or stay in the North Carolina area and trying to figure out where are they going. Specifically, one of my son's really good friends, he's a biomedical engineering major, he went to Israel for an internship because there was money in the tech industry over there to focus on some of these medical sciences. So where can American companies and even these kids go to for capital of their genius ideas?
So when NIH funding contracts, which has happened historically in the past, administrations funds the NIH and other departments at different levels, founders can't just rely on grants to keep their ideas alive, of course. And the good news is there are multiple paths forward. I think we're going to see two things happen. One, I think some good research is going to be put on pause, possibly, throughout this current administration's term, perhaps longer. That's unfortunate when it happens. I think that there are pathways, though, for good ideas to still come to market. And first, on the non-dilutive alternative side, I think it's really important that funders look at what agencies are funding and trying to meet the agencies where they are. Because while total funding has decreased and certain projects just aren't going to get funding, we know that if it's for, certain social issues that are a little bit divisive. We've seen the trans healthcare news coming out of Kaiser Permanente today. Things like that, I think we're just not going to see a lot of funding for coming out of the federal government, full stop. But there are some very interesting broad agency announcements that have come out that are still getting funded in other RFPs. BARDA, for example, has some very interesting RFPs that they've announced over the last few months, and I think we're going to see more of that. DARPA, state economic development funds, disease-focused foundations, and even large health systems are still offering innovation grants. Strategic partners with established industry players, I think, are also going to continue to be important. So looking at the diagnostic companies, the CROs, the hospital networks, because they often can give some resources without founders having to give up as much control or equity as you would in the second option, which of course is pursuing venture and private equity capital perhaps earlier. While venture capital and private equity have kind of fallen off a bit in the first 6 months of the year, we are seeing some early indicators that venture capital is creeping back up for medtech and biotech in the second half of the year. So that's good news. And they are looking more seriously, in my opinion, at diagnostics specifically, especially if you can show a clear reimbursement pathway and a strong commercial story. And that's where I spend a lot of my work, is helping founders translate brilliant science for funders into something that those investors understand, that payers understand. And to your point, I think we also do need to make room for these clinician founders. These are people who live with these gaps in care every day. So they are incredibly well positioned to take an entrepreneurial path in life, if that is something they're called to, because they can see where diagnostics, for example, can change the patient journey. But they are facing steep barriers, lack of business training, conflict of interest rules in hospitals, sheer exhaustion.
I was going to say, trying to juggle it all is so incredibly difficult, which actually brings me back to the NIH funding cuts. And I just want to discuss this even more, because there's whether you're a Republican or a Democrat and how you feel about anything that's going on with this administration, there's still conflict within the Republican Party and even the Democratic Party regarding how we're going to move forward with the NIH. And I had Amory Grammer on the podcast quite a while ago, I would say probably about 6 months ago. And she had worked at the NIH. So she mapped us through what it took to actually create an amazing idea, but how it started years, a decade prior to actually the product's launch. So in your words, how are these inconsistencies and how are these looming cuts, or maybe we have money, maybe we don't, how is what's happening at the NIH going to impact innovation in America?
Sure. I mean, today, you said it yourself, students are facing gaps in internship training, in faculty are going to be leaving universities and pursuing research in other countries. We're seeing lots of faculty already give up research positions here that were once considered, very highly relevant tenure track influential positions within the life sciences and medical research. They're leaving for China, for Germany, for France, countries that are literally giving them money to move their entire laboratories abroad. So I think some of this will become a little bit internationalized. And maybe to a certain extent, that's a good thing, right? That cross-pollination, maybe that means in 10 years, we have a more globalized healthcare system than we have today. And maybe some of that is good. I live abroad myself, so I certainly don't begrudge faculty who see greener pastures elsewhere, especially if they can figure out ways for their students to also move with them. But NIH funding is absolutely essential to the healthcare system that we have today. Every diagnostic test, every treatment, every breakthrough traces in some way to NIH-funded research. It's the seed capital of American medicine. So I think what we're going to see long-term, in 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, maybe even less now that AI is speeding up the path to discovery and speeding us through some basic research, maybe a little faster. I think what we're going to see is a major gap in what the United States' American medicine industry is able to get out the door versus what we're going to see get out the door from China, Germany, and elsewhere. Cuts and freezes don't just slow down research in the lab, they ripple across the entire industry, right? So we're going to see fewer clinical trials, fewer innovations moving into the healthcare pipeline for clinicians to access. In my world, fewer diagnostics getting validated. And in the long run, that means the US is less competitive globally, and countries like China are investing increasingly heavily in biomedical research. So if we fall behind in NIH support, we risk really losing our leadership position in healthcare innovation.
So let me ask you a scenario. If a university lab asked you where to cut and where to double down during a funding squeeze, what would you tell them to protect first?
Their students. Because, so when I was young, I'm not.
I was going to say, you're so incredibly young to think that you started this at 12.
I didn't really think, hey, I'm going to go raise venture capital first. I thought, how long can I bootstrap this? And when I was mentoring earlier stage companies, so very early stage, not out of the lab yet, more of a company on paper than anything else, the first thing I ask is, how long can you bootstrap? Because as soon as you are tied to outside investors, be that federal governments with non-dilutive funding or dilutive funding through VC, you're losing some part of that IP. You're losing some control over that company when it's very, very early stage. And so in some ways, from a strategic perspective, it may force labs that are real innovation centers in this country to bootstrap their innovations longer. And sometimes that can go a certain distance. And that's the first thing that I'd say: protect your students and bootstrap as long as you can. Secondly, though, I would look at the operating costs and overhead for labs. I know that this is something that, just as somebody who was involved in laboratory operations side of academia for a long time, those overhead rates can be very high. And I understand that it does cost a lot of money to run a university, and that these laboratories do benefit from, the library and from all sorts of different, centers on campus besides that one. But that is one of the arguments that this administration has against some of these grant programs, is just seeing these overhead rates increase year after year, sometimes to the tune of like 30-35%. And some of these rates are capped, some of them aren't. But I would negotiate internal with university leadership to see if overhead rates for your laboratory or research center could be decreased for a certain amount of time in order to keep students funded. Because those students can develop technologies, get their names on those patents, and spin out companies. And that might be slower. There might be less capital. It might take longer. But I think that protecting that is going to be most important, far more so than protecting any one anchor faculty member or getting one particular piece of IP out the door and funded.
And we talk about the business model and a new product, and we say it can be two of three things, right? Faster, better, or cheaper. There's one of three ways that you can get there. And it's interesting that you talk about the overhead and looking to decrease to salvage those students and the intellect, because that's what I'm hearing from you. Salvage the intellect, even if it has to be a little slower. If we're going to do better and we're going to do cheaper, we need to not be faster. And that's what we're giving up to look at the long game. And speaking of the long game, rare diseases really take about, some of them up to 9 years to diagnose. What incentive do you think would flip the system so that we can get to detection earlier?
Sure. This is actually a huge issue in diagnostics in general, just because even if we have great science, getting these diagnostic tests into the world takes so long. And some of that's necessary, right? The FDA plays a critical role in making sure that tests are safe, that they are reliable, that they truly benefit patients. And we don't want a system where unvalidated diagnostics flood the market and cause harm. And I'm not just talking about a bad COVID test. I'm talking about, the clinical diagnostics that you are ordering as part of a hospital microbiology lab. I mean, you don't want somebody to go septic, for example, waiting for a test result. But there are smart ways to move faster without cutting corners. So first, companies can design their regulatory strategy early. I see a lot of early diagnostics companies, especially, not building FDA requirements into the development phase of their assays. They'll often treat them as sort of this hurdle at the end when the product is ready for clinical trials, and then they realize that their intended use doesn't align with what the assay actually does. All sorts of mistakes, but even larger diagnostic strategics make these mistakes. So really thinking about regulatory strategy early so that it's baked in. So that means aligning assay design, clinical trial planning, and data collection with regulatory expectations as early as possible in your program. Second, and this is something that we can all advocate for from the clinician side, as well as the diagnostic companies and the researchers, but we need more regulatory clarity and consistency. For diagnostics especially, requirements can feel fragmented. You probably had seen all of this upheaval around laboratory developed tests and what were going to happen. Were they all going to have to get regulated a different way? Class 2 versus class 3. The more predictable the current administration can make the FDA's framework, the more companies can plan early and avoid costly rework on their tests kind of towards the end here. And then, lastly, payers and providers really need to be ready to adopt once a product is cleared. A test doesn't help anybody if it's stuck in limbo because insurance won't reimburse it or because hospitals are slow to add it to their formularies. So early engagement with payers and health systems is critical on the part of the diagnostic company. And these are things that often are sort of left to an onboarded commercial team as the diagnostic is entering clinical trials, which is far too late to get it in the hands of the clinicians so that they can start using these tests with patients and diagnose earlier. As you know, great diagnostics reach faster when companies plan for these requirements at the very beginning, and if they can get them into clinicians' hands as early as possible, and that, in a way that insurance companies will actually reimburse for them.
Exactly. And which actually, I'd love your input on this. So looking at pharmaceutical companies and those who are leading the way, if we look at early diagnosis for a lot of these diseases, do pharmaceutical companies see it as potentially a threat to their revenue because we are treating a disease and the patient no longer needs to be on a medication? Or are they looking at the long-term gain by the medication that the patient may be on for perpetuity? I see this challenge with pharmaceutical companies trying to balance, are we curing or are we helping the patient live for the rest of their lives with this disease?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
It's a great question. And I'm obviously not in the room with every biopharma company, but I do work with a handful. And I can say that the handful that I work with do work very hard to co-develop very often diagnostics that are used alongside therapeutics. But as you know, often diagnosis is seen as sort of like a line item expense as opposed to a cost-saving engine, but they are a cost-saving engine for the patients, not so for hospitals necessarily, and certainly not so for most pharma companies. The example I always give is one that we've probably all been affected by, which is just cancer. If you catch it at stage 1, maybe it costs a few $1,000s in screening and early treatments. But if you catch it at stage 4, that's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in hospitalizations, therapies, long-term care, not to mention the human cost. The same is true for heart disease, diabetes, most infectious diseases, autoimmune conditions. So diagnostics really do shift spending from reactive care to proactive care. And in a $4.8 trillion healthcare system, the savings potential on behalf of the patient is enormous. But of course, we have PMBs in the way, hospitals get their revenue models is based on a certain number of people having stage 4 cancer. And similarly, pharma companies rely on that money that they've, they're trying to earn back the money that they invested to get those drugs to market. So it is a sticky situation. But I do think overall, the biopharma companies that I'm familiar with, they do want these diagnostics because, of course, if they develop the diagnostic, then there is a revenue model for them there. However, the change obviously isn't happening fast enough, especially not fast enough for the clinicians who are faced with this every day, trying to provide better quality care for their patients. And so this is where I think private industry really does have a role. We are seeing a rise in individuals wanting to have more of a hand in their electronic records, right? So that you have your medical records all in one space, because of course that is a gap in the healthcare delivery system today. Patients want to be able to test at home and have certain health data points at home that their clinicians can have access to. And so I do think that private industry outside of biopharma will meet the moment and give individuals in the US more of what they need, which are these diagnostics that they can do at home, patient medical records that they can keep at home and share with clinicians earlier. But it will take a little time.
Elizabeth, you work with executive teams on go-to-market strategies in all of these very regulated spaces. And sometimes it's difficult to prove to investors that you actually have a product that will get to market. So what proof do you tell these science startups that they need to build first and focus on so that there isn't overspending and that all of their work for 1, 2, 3 years is not futile because they can't get grants or funding or external money into the system that they want to build?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that there are a couple of different areas here, but one thing to remember is that a lot of the breakthroughs are already here. So what I actually spend a lot of time talking about is to investors. So when I'm speaking to a room of VCs and private equity, I tell them, hey, the breakthroughs are here. We have point of care diagnostics that give results in minutes instead of days. AI is helping radiologists, pathologists spot things earlier and more accurately. Telehealth is expanding access in rural and underserved areas. There are so many great technologies, and they really just need additional funding and additional support at the business level in order to scale. So what's really interesting, I think, especially with this drop in federal funding, is that a lot of these academic universities, national labs, they have tech transfer offices that essentially mentor young companies and give them those business skills maybe that they're lacking, or at least bolster it until there's enough funding for them to hire on a commercial team. But if companies are looking for venture funding or private equity funding earlier, they need to know, A, how to have those conversations earlier, which is a self-education thing, unfortunately, at this stage. But B, those investors also need to realize that these entrepreneurs are coming to them with less business acumen than before. And sometimes the business acumen wasn't that strong, even with those tech transfer programs, right? And so I think it's really important that we're not just telling funders, hey, don't lose hope. Here's a better way to pitch, or some early stage funds that are investing earlier. I think it's also important that venture capital and private equity also see that there are some innovations that are just right to take off in the markets. Patients are ready, clinicians are ready, but they need funding, and they're also going to need that mentoring that maybe those particular funds haven't had to do as much of in the past.
And maybe that's a way that those who take equity can separate themselves from those who are giving grants, because I really wanted to know, everyone says, go after the grants because they don't take equity. But when an application hits the NIH or a university or a foundation review panel, what separates the winner from the one that gets rejected?
Did I lose you there?
I don't know. Did you lose me?
I think I lost you. I'm sorry. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, of course. And I'm going to repeat it because I'm going to break right now, which is at 32 and 30. I'm going to look around that mark. So we're going to start again. See, I'm getting good at this, right? So everyone always says, go for the grants that don't take the equity, because there is a twist that if you go for those that will take the equity, hopefully they can offer something, right? Some type of learning, some type of mentorship, some type of guidance, but really you don't want to give your equity away. So when an application hits the NIH or the university or a foundation review panel, what separates the one that gets chosen versus the one that gets rejected?
So I don't know if anybody knows that answer right now, because I think, as you said, just like the funding is boomeranging, I think the criteria is boomeranging. I'm hearing very different things out of the FDA than I heard even 3 months ago. And those are for projects that are either in the pre-sub process, or they're getting ready for clinical trials or entering clinical trials. So on the grant side, we're hearing kind of the same thing. But what I would argue is, don't think that this is the same market that we were in a year ago in terms of grant funding. Grants are going to be more competitive than they already were. Grants are going to have to meet certain criteria that they didn't have to before. And we need to meet that market where it is. Just like you wouldn't go in and pitch venture capital, like a fund that doesn't fund diagnostics. I'm not going to go in and like try to target them. I'm just not going to get funded. We need to treat agencies the same way. And so I would tell funders to pay very close attention to what's the language in the RFPs or the BAAs that they're responding to, and not assume that we're in the same market that we were a year ago. There are also resources, especially at the institutions that are that have very good grant writers on staff. So the research institutes that get a lot of money, who are adapting their approaches real time as they're getting these responses from agencies on what's not getting funded, what is getting funded, and why. But I think that most people are going to be a little bit in the dark for the foreseeable future on what agencies are funding and why, and to just pay close attention that you're not pitching something that isn't going to get funded. Use your university resources, for example, to make sure that you're putting the strongest application forward, or skip it and find a different pathway for that particular research project for now.
And let's move to now the next phase. So you have 90 seconds in front of a healthcare CFO or hospital CFO, and you really need to pitch a new diagnostic because you need to pilot it inside a system that actually works. How do you get the CFO to say yes, pilot it here, versus just a polite no, or, somebody who ghosts you?
Yeah, good question. So hopefully you're already in the room with a CFO that you have some level of confidence is going to green light this project. So for example, maybe this particular healthcare system, maybe the clinician or nurse that came up with this idea came out of that hospital system. That's a very typical pathway for these pilot projects to take root. But I think it's very important that you make sure that you are ready with a couple of things. One, that you know that you're going to clear the FDA's bar for analytical and clinical validity, and that you can communicate that clearly to whoever you're pitching. Hospitals and clinics should be scored on time to diagnosis for common pathways like suspected sepsis or heart disease or autoimmune conditions. So if you shorten that timeline safely, you should be reimbursed better. That also means your diagnostic has more chance of commercial success. Safety stays intact, but speed becomes part of the job of your diagnostic. So making sure that you're clearly communicating that impact to the hospital is incredibly important. So you're not just clearing the bar, but you are having real impact in terms of time to diagnosis, for example. And the other piece where tests stall in the marketplace, and this is something hospitals know very well, is when payers wait years for perfect data. So coverage with evidence models are incredibly important. So reimburse a promising guideline-supported test while the company and health system collect outcomes in real patients. That can be a win-win for the hospital as well as for the diagnostics company. So just making sure that you can show that that's where your head is at in terms of reimbursement. So the CFO understands the commercial model that you're going to be running with post-clinical trial.
And then how do we ensure that we are actually backing the next breakthrough as opposed to the next Elizabeth Holmes? Because I think back to, Elizabeth Holmes, for those who don't know, the Theranos founder who was convicted of fraud. She misled investors and patients. She had this false blood test where somebody at home could actually do a little finger prick and then actually get a full lab panel, as opposed to somebody who actually needed to give a vial of blood. And I'm just thinking about what due diligence is needed by that CFO or by the person who is going to invest in a company. What are you asking? What are the right questions to ask?
They're really good questions. So, Elizabeth, something really interesting about Elizabeth Holmes is her fiance now is running some other blood testing company, and he's getting funding for it, which is just
unreal.
to me, right? Like how? Um, my advice to hospitals typically is to invest in diagnostics because they're honestly usually not very expensive investments, unlike therapeutic, which is a very expensive investment and takes years and years and years to see payback on. Diagnostics are not that same, expense on, especially if they're at the stage where they're pitching hospital leadership. So number one, invest in diagnostics because most of these companies are not Elizabeth Holmes. Most of them are founded by researchers or by clinicians. And they do this, they've been working hard for this particular thing. They're not looking to have that reputational damage. I would also say not to see them as a budget drain, to see them as a value multiplier. And, every test that provides an earlier answer prevents downstream costs, it prevents suffering. One area that we see hit really hard in hospital pitches is the fact that, if we can diagnose and then treat faster, we're going to see fewer, hopefully, HIAs, so infections that a patient or a nurse or clinician pick up in the hospital. We'll see obviously fewer patient mortalities, hopefully. And that requires both a mindset and a structural change, of course. So updating those reimbursement models that we've spoken a little bit about, investing in data integration, empowering clinicians to order the tests they need without a lot of bureaucratic friction. But if these hospital leaders start prioritizing diagnostics, they'll see better outcomes and lower long-term costs for their hospitals. And also hopefully kind of be movement makers in diagnostics and become known for that. If you look at different hospital systems, they obviously have different reputations for how innovative they are and the amount of the type of care and quality of care that patients have access to. So this can really be a feather in the cap of hospitals that are looking to bolster their brands in terms of patient outcomes and clinician satisfaction.
What's hot right now? So if we're looking at the healthcare sector and we're looking at where investors are putting in their money, where grants want to be able to give their money, whether we look at venture capitalists or when you look at PC, what's hot?
My favorites are the companies that are trying to crack the nut of how do we get more healthcare into the home. So how can we decentralize diagnostics? How can we make diagnostics as simple as putting on an Oura ring or a Fitbit, but with more clinical relevance, because obviously those data points aren't overly clinically relevant. But think about how much money individuals have spent on those options because they're so hungry to understand their sleep patterns, other factors that can affect their daily health and wellness. And so I think that whichever diagnostic company can get that home health lab into homes and those the data points into electronic medical records that both the patient has access to in a way that they can understand and their clinician has in a way that they can understand and make better diagnosis and treatment recommendations. I think that is what is hot. And the reason it's hot is because there are several companies trying to do it. Nobody has done it yet. I think it's going to be really interesting when it happens because I think we're going to see patients armed with much better information to take to their insurance companies, to their doctors. They'll have more choice in how they get their healthcare managed. And I think that is really where we're going to see major change. Now, there are also some really interesting things going on in liquid biopsy, imaging, radiology, AI, obviously, in healthcare is going to be a huge factor. But I really do think whoever figures out at-home laboratory testing in a decentralized yet cohesive way, that's really going to be the next rock star in diagnostics.
And it's really interesting you say that because the Medicare system just approved new codes for remote therapeutic monitoring. So even being ahead of the game to say, okay, if we can get some of these at-home diagnostic items in place, It can help with the physician shortage because we can perhaps extend times that a patient actually has to follow up with his or her doctor or clinician. And you also have the patient responsible for his or her illness as opposed to putting it all into the healthcare system. So I really like that. I finally have an aha moment. So I thank you, Elizabeth. I got my aha moment. But I also want to look at the long game. So with these companies that are starting up, we're looking several years down the pipeline. And when you think about the financial people, they're focused on quarterly revenue, right? And net profit or net loss, and trying to figure out their quarterly targets. So how do these founders scale these long-term goals versus their finance side saying, I'm looking at my quarterly numbers, I'm looking at my quarterly numbers. What's that happy medium?
Yeah. You know, like I said before, I think breakthroughs are already here, and it's really more sometimes about getting them into markets. Oftentimes, that's the biggest challenge. It's adoption. Once the diagnostic or your medical device is adopted, then you start to see revenue come in. It can be a little more predictable. It's a lot easier to sell to your second customer than it was to sell to your first, and so on. So the biggest challenge is adoption. So if you're a founder, what that means is thinking really early about reimbursement model, thinking really early about regulatory strategy, not trying to bolt that on to some sort of vague, the commercial team will figure that out during clinical trials. I think from a healthcare leadership perspective, I think that means that hospital systems, especially, they haven't necessarily been built for the uptake of new diagnostic tools. And they really need to be. Hospitals can be conservative about change, but this is the time, I think, to meet the moment, because, you know, hospitals can have a piece of that pie and see some of these new technologies. You know, if they own part of the company because they've invested, then of course they're going to benefit when that technology is successful, and not just in their hospital, but in other hospitals as well. So there are innovation arms at hospitals that are, of course, investing in some of this technology themselves, and they stand to benefit long term from that, the royalties from that IP. And the other place where I think we need to see a lot more change is in these reimbursement lags within insurance. And that's a whole other conversation. But of course, that entire industry is ripe for change. And so I'm watching that market very closely as well. And then sort of lastly, you know, I know this sounds like it's something completely in left field, Meredith, but the other area where I'm mentoring a lot of startups and working on the consulting side is this area where life sciences, especially medtech and diagnostics, and space exploration coincide. And I know that sounds crazy, but medicine in space is in microgravity situations is very different than medicine on Earth. And if we're looking at having these larger and larger space stations and asteroid mining operations, which are being funded both by venture capital as well as increasingly by federal governments, we're also going to need medical tools and technologies that work in those environments. So I would encourage researchers and founders not just to think about, okay, what are the obvious applications for this technology I'm developing, but where else can I look for some of this funding? What other applications might the same technology have? And maybe you'll find that a whole new world of non-dilutive grants, as well as venture capital who you can pitch, opens up to you just by thinking about slightly different applications for the same test or therapeutic.
So we're going to go back to Star Trek and Star Wars and figure out how the two combine.
Absolutely.
So I really want to talk about your book. It's called The Giant's Ladder, and it is a blueprint for turning complex ideas into clear stories. And I'd like for you to share what you think is the messaging trap that scientists fall into.
Sure. You know, communication is that bridge between a great diagnostic tool like we've been talking about today and the moment it changes a patient's life. So it's so critically important that we get this right. And once that technology leaves your hands and is in the hands of somebody delivering it to a patient, like a clinician, the clinician needs to know how to talk about it as well. So it's so incredibly important. And the reason why I wrote the book is to help scientists and innovators translate their breakthroughs into real world adoption. And diagnostics, as well as therapeutics, as well as materials that go into these products, they might be scientifically brilliant, but if they're not understood, trusted, and adopted by the people who need them, like clinicians, hospital administrations, payers, they won't get a chance to make an impact. And also your company will go under, and who wants that? So really, I think that the most important theme in my book is how do you avoid that trap? It's also very similar to Jeffrey Moore's technology adoption curve and that break that sort of happens between doctors, right? So maybe you get your first hospital on board and it's a great trial site for you, but you can't quite bring on your real first paying customer. There's a gap there. And so making sure that you're partnering with commercial experts who can help you bridge that gap is so critically important, because if you are a clinician and a funder or a founder, excuse me, or you are a researcher and now a founder, it's very difficult to also be the marketer, the business development strategist, your fundraising strategist, and all these other hats that you're being asked to wear. So my book is a great primer for those people so that you start kind of talking the language and you know what questions to ask. But my recommendation to fast track these is to bring on a great consulting firm that can help you. Besides High Touch, my firm, there are several others out there who work in this field every single day and bring innovations to markets. And so that's typically my advice is, hey, just like you wouldn't not go to a specialist clinician if you need a rheumatologist, you're also going to need to hire support in this realm likely as well.
And I think that's a really important topic to bring up, because when I teach my medical business management program at Florida Atlantic University, I talk oftentimes about when to bring in consultants. When do you bring in your accountant? When do you bring in your lawyer, right? You are not supposed to be able to wear many hats, and it's not good to be cheap and to try to be, as the old saying goes, penny wise and pound foolish, but to be able to be strategic. And I can't know everything. I always say the smartest person in the room is not the person with the highest IQ. It's the person who knows who to ask. And being able to utilize resources like consultants for different areas where you don't have expertise is so vital. It's just stay out of my lane, and then you can assist me in the lane in which I need help. But let me ask you my final question, because this would not be a working healthcare interview if I didn't conclude this way. If you, Elizabeth Chabe, could create one change within our American healthcare system, because I do believe we do have the best healthcare system, even though you're not living in America right now, we do have the best healthcare system, but it is still flawed, and you can't fix something you don't understand. That's why we have working healthcare, so we can shed light on the different aspects. But if you could create one change within our American healthcare system, what would it be?
So I'll pick one. Sorry, I'll pick one. I'll play by the rules. It would be just in general to remove these barriers that we have to diagnostic testing. I mean, every month that a diagnostic test is delayed, that diagnosis is delayed, it means lost time for patients. We need to value diagnostics not as an expense, but as an entry point for effective care. So that would be my magic wands. But I would also say, I've had the benefit of experiencing some really great healthcare systems in places where I don't think people think there is a great healthcare system there. I'll just give you one example, and that's Vietnam. I lived there for 3 years in Da Nang, right in the center of the country. I have never had better patient care. Not in the United States, not in France, not in Mexico, nowhere. And I don't. The facilities were state of the art. They get you in, they get you out. You sat down with a doctor for It could be an hour to go through all of the different tests. Your medical records were given to you immediately, and they also kept them in their system. And I could go to any of these hospitals around the country, and they immediately knew who my doctors were, all of my tests, all of my appointments. It was relatively seamless. And of course, they had the benefit of building this healthcare system fairly new, from the 80s on. And we have, a longer history. So there's obviously a lot more threads there to kind of coalesce and make work. But I do think that there are some really great healthcare opportunities for us to look at in other countries and see, maybe there are some things that we can learn from them. But my magic lever would be to remove those diagnostic barriers.
You are not the only person who's told me about the Vietnamese healthcare system. I have a very, very good friend who traveled abroad to Vietnam with her sister and brother, and her sister ended up in the hospital. And for all of the care that she got, and she raved about the care that she got, it was like $114 US dollars. I don't recall their monetary. What do they use?
The dong.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it was like 114,000 dong, and she freaked out. And my friend said, I think that's in their money, not ours. Let's get the translation into American dollars. But it was so low, and she had such a phenomenal experience. That is on my to-do list. I guess my new hobby, learn more about the Vietnam healthcare system to see what we could replicate.
Absolutely. I recommend going and experiencing it. Just like if you ever need like anything, like I had a motorbike accident while I was living there, and I had to get braces as an adult, which was awful, but I did it, and the care was incredible. My orthodontist was amazing. I think it cost me $200 to have full top and bottom braces.
So everybody's going to Vietnam for their braces.
Go to Vietnam for braces. I'm not a plastic surgery person myself, but if you're investigating that, a lot of people go to both South Korea and Vietnam for that.
And Turkey. I saw a bunch of people in Istanbul. I didn't realize what was happening. I thought they were burn victims, and then realized they were there for hair transplant. So yes, there are a lot of places for that, but I need to research a little bit more. I think I'm focused on what Australia and England and Canada do, because they are English-speaking countries, and I need to broaden my horizons so we can figure out tools to fix our American healthcare system. So Elizabeth Chabe, thank you for enlightening us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Meredith.
To everyone listening, the full video of this episode is now on YouTube. Search Working Healthcare and hit subscribe so you don't miss future interviews, short clips, and behind-the-scenes moments. Got a question, an episode idea, or someone you think we should feature? Drop me a line at meredithhirsh.com. If this conversation hit home or made you think a little differently, don't keep it to yourself. Share the episode, tag a friend, or post it on social media. You can also follow us at Working Healthcare on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and connect with me on LinkedIn. That's where we keep the conversation going in between episodes. The more voices we bring into this space, the more momentum we build, because change doesn't start with a policy. It starts with a real conversation like this. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Subscribe and don't miss what's next, because you can't fix the U.S. healthcare system until you understand it. I'm Meredith Hirsh. Tune in weekly as we explore the inner workings of healthcare.